today's discussion, where we talk about the promotional process in the FBI, culture, and some of the issues that developed that led to the change of the culture of the FBI and the current system that we have to this day. So first off, I want to talk about something or elaborate on something that a friend of mine who had listened to the program had pointed out. And this is somebody that I had worked with, former Bureau employee. And the comment that the friend of mine had made was that when I made the comment about being at FBI headquarters and how miserable of an experience that was, and how the right people aren't sent to FBI headquarters for leadership development, my friend pointed out that those folks are not necessarily having the worst experience of their life. For example, his particular case, because he had done headquarters time, it really wasn't all of that bad. But when I drilled down and got to the bottom of the differences between our experiences, this individual had been at an off-site location at headquarters, and in the off-site location, it wasn't that bad. And of course, it's not a pleasant experience. Being at headquarters of any organization never is. But I don't think his experience was quite as bad as mine. But I pointed out the difference, and that was, number one, I was at the Hoover building, and I worked directly under Mueller. I had to attend the meetings that he was putting on every day. And I also had a boss that was one of those, quote, blue flamers, one of the people that was doing everything he could to advance in the organization and consequently made the experience very miserable. But we had a saying in the Bureau, and that was that your life got worse the closer you got to the flagpole. And I was sitting right underneath the flagpole, which made it particularly bad. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, the other thing that we had discussed, this friend of mine and I, is that we talked about the 5 to 7 year term limits for supervisors. Remember, initially it was a 5-year up or out policy, and then through lawsuits and complaints from the frontline supervisors, it was later extended to 7 years, and that's where the policy is today. Now, what happened was you ended up having a lot of people that did not want to be at headquarters, and so they either stepped down and went back to the field, or they tried to promote up into the system. And the way that you would have to do that, or the way that it worked in the FBI, is that you would have to latch onto somebody that would maybe be 2 or 3 rungs above your particular pay grade and then ride their coattails to progress up. And so this was not always the people that you would want to be in management or leadership positions. And that ended up leaving a bad culture with the people that were left behind. And that created the culture of yes people. And I talked about that in episode 1, that Robert Mueller was someone that was not collaborative in his leadership style. He was not somebody that cared about your ideas. He was not somebody that wanted to brainstorm with people that had the collective experience. He wanted somebody that was going to tell him what he wanted to hear. I gave some examples of that, and that was it. And if you did not agree with him, did not tell him what you wanted to hear, then he was going to remove you from your position. And if you had spent time there, you realized very quickly you better tell that man what he wants to hear, or else you're going to be gone. This was not a leadership style that was conducive to law enforcement or for intelligence, specifically intelligence for that matter. It created an environment where it was always just whatever made the man happy, give it to him. And coming from previous law enforcement life and a previous military life, I know that goes contrary to any leadership style I had seen anywhere else I had been. And in fact, it was pretty astounding to me. Now, to paint the picture, now this is not Mark speaking here. I'm going to give you the perception from a particular reporter. Now, in episode 1, I had discussed a Time magazine article that I had read. And how I came across this article in 2011, I was going overseas to do some training for the FBI. And where I was going, it was going to be about a 22-hour flight. So I had a lot of free time on this flight, and you can only watch so many movies. So I was walking through the airport, and I saw on the newsstand Time magazine. And guess who was on the cover of Time magazine? It was Robert Mueller III. And I saw that. Now, I typically do not read or watch anything law enforcement, military, or FBI because, frankly, it's what I do for a living. It's what I did for a living. And there's just no way I could work all day, 10, 12 hours a day, and then go home and watch something about the job that I was doing, mainly because anything I read was wrong. and it did not reflect what I did in reality in any way, shape, or form. So I just never bothered watching it. But for some reason, I thought, well, I'm going to be on this plane, and I'm interested in seeing what reporters have to say about this man, because I had learned long ago, when I was a police officer, I worked in a big city, and much of what I worked on as a police officer ended up in the news, either the paper or the local news reports. And I remember it striking me that almost nothing I read in the paper or saw on television had any resemblance to the reality of the incident that I was present for. In fact, I may have been the person handling the scene, and then I would read about it in the news or watch it in the news and realize these people had no idea what they were talking about. So it was through that prism that any article that I read, I just knew that it was going to be inaccurate. But when I got on the plane and I read this article, I was struck by how accurate it was. And it was the first time that I had read an article that portrayed the Robert Mueller that I knew, that I had observed in the FBI. And this was an article that was written by Barton Gellman, and this is from Time Magazine, published May 9th of 2011. And I'm going to quote from the article. So just bear with me here. I'm going to read through this, and then we're going to circle back and talk about some of the issues that are raised in here. Now, again, this is not Mark talking here. This is Barton Gellman, who was a reporter that was given access to Robert Mueller. Apparently, he spent a day with him, so it was sort of a day in the life with Robert Mueller. So this is just a couple of paragraphs from that article. Mueller's interrogation of SACs, according to David Schlendorf, the FBI's assistant director for resource planning, arose from a frustrating question. Quote, how do I, as one person, pull the levers so that 35,000 people do what I want them to do? Schlendorf embodies a startling invasion of private sector managers into Mueller's FBI. He arrived as a special assistant in 2003 with a Harvard MBA and was amazed to discover that he had to walk down the hall to find the internet. Within 5 years, he had leapfrogged a generation of agents to the FBI's top executive ranks. Mueller wants more like him and makes regular recruiting trips to business schools. Their graduates have brought modern office tools to an FBI that still cannot buy a box of pencils without filling out Form FD-369 and quadruplicate using carbon paper. They also brought exotic business jargon and a 4-color FBI strategy map of arrows chasing ovals. Outsiders displaced agents with badges and guns as assistant directors in charge of finance, human resources, information technology, and the Directorate of Weapons of Mass Destruction. Now, I think that last one is very interesting, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. Mueller spurred the change of guard with an upper-out rule for field supervisors. Hundreds retired, quit, or removed from their posts, an enormous loss of collective memory. Quote, these were people who knew their craft very well, says Konrad Matka, president of the FBI Agents Association. Quote, there are certain things the field knows and certain things headquarters knows, and sometimes they don't exactly mesh. The old guard calls Mueller's rising stars the, quote, blue flamers, end quote, which is not a compliment. Schlendorf was equally undiplomatic. Quote, to use a loaded term, the legacy employees, sometimes we've had an issue where they might be threatened by the younger, newer generation, more tech-savvy, end quote, he says. Quote, so that's been a challenge, but we need to be competing with Google, with GE, for the best talent, end quote. And then there is Mueller himself. Years ago, when he ran the Justice Department's criminal division, subordinates dubbed him Bobby Three Sticks. The mob-style sobriquet made a sport of his Brahmin demeanor, and by the way, Brahmin means sort of upper-class New England elitism, and fancy Philadelphia name, Robert Swan Mueller III. Only an old friend, Associate Deputy Director David Margolis, quote, has ever used that name to my face, end quote, Mueller says. In the FBI, it is not pronounced with affection. Mike Mason, who retired in 2007, says Mueller's Princeton diploma and prep school pedigree gave agents an excuse to oppose the reforms. Quote, people tend to look for, how are you not like me? Why is it okay for me not to like this? So very interesting, and I'm going to cover some of those points. Now, later on in the article, it goes on to say, most people inside the Bureau believe the blown opportunities to head off 9/11 would never occur today. Now, keep in mind, this is written in 2011. Even among the FBI's doubters, few disagree that the Bureau has come a long way. Comey, whom Mueller has described as privately as his preferred successor. Now, keep in mind, at the time I read this article, I had no idea who James Comey was, so this name would have not meant anything to me at the time. But we could see that the seeds were being sown at that time. So I'm going to continue here. When Mueller has described privately as being his preferred successor, and he says it will take another generation, this is Comey talking, to reach the goals that Mueller set. Quote, I think he has started the turning of the cultural battleship, Comey says. I don't know if it's a quarter turn or a half turn, but the job of the next director is to keep pushing. So you can see there that Comey saw himself as being the legacy for Robert Mueller and was going to push to have his legacy continued. Now, there's a lot there, and that's only a fraction of the article. So, number one, you can see a real contempt for agents themselves. In fact, it was well known in the FBI that when Robert Mueller took over, that frankly, he didn't care for agents all that much. He believed in intelligence analysts. He did not believe in agents, really didn't question agents. And he started the culture at headquarters where he really wanted to hear from intel analysts. And when you would go to these morning meetings, oftentimes he would only want to hear from the analysts, and he would not want to hear from the agents themselves. I experienced that on a lot of occasions where I would go to briefings and I would be told not to speak at all. It would be my analyst that would have to speak, but that was true of all of the units. So he came in with this idea that he did not trust the agents, and in fact nearly quadrupled the number of intelligence analysts over the next decade that were hired. And getting the FBI to move from an agent badge-carrying sworn law enforcement, and that's going to be key there too, sworn law enforcement agency to an intelligence analyst agency, which is a lot like the other intelligence agencies that are out there, because that's really what he was trying to do. He was trying to make the FBI an intelligence agency. Now, that's important, and I've covered this with a lot of people over the years, that being sworn law enforcement is critical. Remember, the FBI is a law enforcement agency. It has intelligence components. It has counterterrorism components, but even counterterrorism is a law enforcement aspect. Now, the reason why I point that out is law enforcement officers are sworn, meaning that you, particularly with an FBI agent, your testimony is key, and it is illegal to lie to an FBI agent. You've seen that. You've seen that in the public realm here in the last couple of years. It's illegal to do that, and the testimony of a sworn law enforcement officer is important in a court of law. And when I first came into the Bureau, the attitude was if an FBI agent said it, it happened, right? Now, that's important because later in the cultural shift in the FBI, when all of these analysts that were brought in, these are not sworn law enforcement people. And you would see lots of ramifications of that. You would have non-sworn law enforcement intelligence analysts overseeing units in the FBI, basically overseeing agents and giving direction. And then later actually giving direction in cases themselves, which I believe should have never happened and really put the organization down the course of where we ran into a lot of the problems that we have now. And that's an important distinction. But why did that happen? So you notice from this article in Time magazine, the reporter points out that Mueller, because he did not trust agents, he did not like what was going on at the upper levels of the FBI and wanted to change those. The way that he wanted to fix the FBI was to bring in people from outside of the organization. So they were not law enforcement people. They were not military people, and they had no experience in law enforcement. Notice that David Schlendorf said that he wanted to recruit the best talent from Google, GE, and then other companies as well, as if the FBI is a business operation. It is not a business operation. He did not say that he wanted to bring in the best law enforcement minds, best law enforcement people, best military intel people. He didn't do that. He wanted to bring in the best business people. And I noticed during that time myself, in fact, I used to make fun of it, how much business jargon was used in meetings that I would go to at headquarters. And I used to think to myself, are we IBM? Are we Apple? Are we GE? Because I didn't recognize the terminology anymore. And I had been in law enforcement and the military prior to coming into the FBI. And so he came in and he started bringing in other people like him with Mueller's permission that brought into this business culture. And oftentimes these people were very, very young and they had no experience whatsoever. And they would come in and they would start giving direction to seasoned law enforcement professionals. And so with that began the weeding out process of some of the most experienced law enforcement agents in the FBI. So looking at that 5 to 7 year up or out policy, it was very, very destructive. When I first came into the FBI, the most experienced agents you had were the frontline supervisors. And so these are people that are close enough to the field that they understand cases and work the cases, but aren't so senior that they've gotten away and don't understand the job any longer. But Mueller had removed that position, or gotten a lot of people to leave that position, whether they retired, whether they quit, or whether they moved up. And it just was very destructive to the organization. And so when you went back to headquarters, like I did, I promoted it after a decade and went to headquarters. And I remember going into the unit that I was in, which was pretty much run by the analysts that were there, and I never understood that because the people that knew how to work cases were the agents, again, the sworn law enforcement personnel, but we ended up taking direction from the analysts, many of whom had not only not ever worked a case, many of them had never been outside of the building in headquarters, let alone worked a case. And so I would come in with my experience and have discussions which would be overridden by people that had never worked in this field whatsoever. And again, that was Robert Mueller that wanted that. So that was the beginning of the change of the culture. Now, I mentioned in the first episode that Robert Mueller was very autocratic, and he wanted to do a 180 from what Louis Freeh had done, because just as a reminder, Louis Freeh had taken all of the agents that were at headquarters and put them into the field because his attitude was FBI agents do investigations. And if you're sitting at your desk, you can't be doing an agent's job. The agent's job is to get out and interview and collect information and report that information, and you can't do that sitting at your desk. Your job is to get out and talk to people. Robert Mueller, because he wanted to pull that lever and control 35,000 people, brought many of them back into FBI headquarters. In fact, it was much bigger than what Louis Freeh had ever had, and needed people to man this monstrosity of an organization that he had developed, and really needed a lot of bodies to come back because he felt like the agent's job was to answer to him and do exactly what he wanted them to do. So he needed numbers of people, but it was very difficult to get people to come to headquarters for a number of reasons. One, it's very expensive to move to Washington, D.C. Two, it became very well known that it was not going to be a pleasurable experience. And number three, you were going to have to answer to him, and your input was largely not important to him. So in order to get the sheer number of agents to run this monstrosity that Mueller wanted, he had to bring a large number of agents back to headquarters. Now remember, every time an agent is brought back to headquarters, they are not necessarily replaced in the field because the number of FBI agents in the nation is limited by Congress. So there's a finite number of agents, and he wanted more people back at headquarters. So in order to do this, to get the sheer number of people, he instituted what was known as the 18-month rotational program. What that meant was you could volunteer from the field to come back to headquarters and work there and be there for 18 months and then rotate back to the field, but then keep that supervisory status, meaning the pay. So there was incentives for people to do that. But that brought a cadre of people that you probably didn't want at headquarters, were probably not there for the right reasons, and they were very limited in the amount of time that they were going to be there. So A, there was not a vested interest in many cases for them to do a really good job. And also, in the field, there was a tendency to not necessarily listen to these supervisors because, after all, they weren't going to be there. They were very limited in the amount of time that they were going to be there. It was not a well-thought-out program, and it was used just to man headquarters. But what it did do is bring in a number of people that went, tested the waters, and in some cases decided, well, look, I can move up. I'm not making it in the field. I'm not successful in the field, but maybe I will move on up the ranks in the FBI. And then what they learned at that point was the nepotism system, or the good old boy system, as we like to call it in the FBI. And that is that in the FBI, in order to get ahead, and I mentioned this last session, it didn't necessarily mean that you were better than the next person. It meant that you maneuvered or maybe even took the next person out next to you. So it's a cold way of saying it, but that's pretty much the way that it was. And the way that you got ahead at that point was you would find somebody that was maybe 2 or 3 rungs above you, got on their good side, told them what they wanted to hear, which was the Mueller method of management, and then just glob onto those people, ride their coattails, and then move on up. That's why if you go run FBI divisions, it's not uncommon to see a person that came from a division and then look around them to their underlings or to the people below them and find that those people came from the same division that they came from. Unlike the military system where people are promoted and then you're just put into different units, you have no say as to what unit you go into. So it keeps things sort of even and less chance of nepotism. Not that it can't happen, but there's less chance of it. But in the FBI, it's pretty much the case across the board. So people are bringing up the people that they want around them. Now, if you talk to people in the FBI, oftentimes they'll say, but yeah, I want to bring in the people that I trust, the people that know what they're doing. But in reality, it's just the people that they know and the people that will follow their orders without any kind of a question. And that's not a leadership model that you want by any stretch of the imagination. Now, how that relates to where we are right now, I want you to think about what's in the press. Think about the text from Strzok and Page and McCabe and all the others that are there. You notice that these are people that are like-minded. After all, no one questioned at all the text. You don't see any questioning going on in this text when Page and Strzok are saying, hey, I want to consider this when we were in Andy's office. And the way they talk about this, it's apparent that everybody is in agreement and nobody is questioning the actions that are being taken. Nobody's questioning anything. And that's not a leadership environment that you want, but that is the leadership environment that was created under Mueller. Furthermore, you have somebody like Lisa Page, who was not sworn law enforcement. She was an FBI attorney, right? She was brought in, she was an FBI attorney, but yet she's making law enforcement decisions when she's not a sworn law enforcement officer. And that's what I'm talking about, where non-law enforcement people, and by the way, when I say sworn, I mean people with arrest authority, the authority to arrest people, to take their liberties away from them. Lisa Page was not one of these people, but she was in on these decisions. She wasn't consulting as an attorney. She was actually going in, if you recall in the news, she was actually going in and changing FT 302s, or the report of an interview, actually changing the interviews, and these would be interviews that she wasn't even present for. That's where I'm saying the FBI has lost its way in allowing people like this to be making law enforcement decisions where they should not be involved in that. And under no circumstances should someone who is not actually involved or present at an interview be changing the report of an interview, an FD 302. That is unheard of. And that only started happening during the Mueller and then later the Comey years. That was allowed to happen. These people were at headquarters, and it was through Mueller's management style, this autocratic style, that we will run everything from headquarters. Cases will be run from headquarters, where this started to happen. Under no circumstances should cases be run from headquarters. That's what field offices are for, and that is what field agents are for. But under Mueller, because he wanted total control from headquarters, that's when that began to happen. I remember being a program manager overseeing cases, and it would be dictated down to me that I would call out to the field and tell field offices how to run their cases, how to run their sources, how to do all these different types of things, which was a completely foreign concept prior to the Mueller years, and then compounded even worse under the Comey years. So that is what led up to the situation that we're in right now with the Bureau, and it's something that unfortunately has become solidified, with the new generation of agents. It became apparent to me towards the end of my career that there were not many pre-9/11 agents left. And that's a shame, because the people that are in the organization now don't realize that it was ever run a different way. But that's the dilemma that we're in right now. And as we continue on with the next sessions, we're going to start talking about this a little bit more and how the possible solutions to all of this. But I hope you find this interesting. I hope this has been informative for you. We're going to have some exciting discussions next week. I plan on having a couple of people in here to interview them. These are going to be former Bureau employees, and they will give you their perspective as well. Again, this is a perspective that you've not heard anywhere else. If you like what you're hearing, give me a like, give me a follow. Please share this podcast with all your friends, family, and even people that aren't friends or family. You can share that with them too. We'd love that. So look forward to you next time. Take care. This is Mark Vines, and we will see you soon.